Before we dive into the history of diversity initiatives, I need to be transparent with you about something. I have deliberately avoided addressing this topic publicly since the controversy began, and that's unusual for me. Here's why this matters. I co-founded and led Spencer Stuart's global diversity practice for 10 years, not because I sought out to, but because senior leadership asked me to take it on. Later, Google recruited me to lead their executive search team, in part because of my expertise, not just in identifying and recruiting underrepresented talent, but in understanding how to build systems that work for all talent. I am, rather obviously, a Black woman, born in this country to Black parents who were descendants of enslaved people. But I also had advantages. Educated parents who insisted my brother and I pursue the best educational opportunities, and they had the resources to support that vision. We excelled academically. We both attended top universities for graduate and undergraduate programs that positioned us for success. My brother's been a successful lawyer for over 35 years, and, well, I just shared most of my background. Where we advantaged by diversity programs, honestly, I doubt it, but I'll never really know to be certain. What I do know is that we both performed well when we entered the workforce, in spite of the blatant and often insidiously covert treatment we sometimes encountered from colleagues, bosses, and clients along the way. I'm sharing this because I want you to understand I've lived this from multiple angles as a beneficiary of opportunity, as someone who's faced discrimination despite credentials, and as someone who spent decades helping organizations think strategically about inclusion. So when I talk about diversity initiatives, I'm not speaking theoretically. I'm speaking from lived experience and professional expertise. Hi, I'm Jenny Clark, a conscious leadership expert who spent 2 decades in executive recruiting and talent management, having worked with giants like Google and Spencer Stuart. I discovered that the secret to transformative leadership lies in the 5 dimensions of conscious leadership. And I'm here to help you unlock your full potential. Join me on this channel as we embark on an honest and vulnerable journey together to become the kind of leader that genuinely inspires transformation in your organization. I have a few ways you can get involved in this conscious community. First, I've created a free career map to help you uncover your next career move. Second, I've created exclusive content for you with a community of like-minded leaders. And lastly, I send out a free newsletter every other week. To learn more, check out the description of this video. Now, let's look at where all this actually came from. Until very recently, if you walked into any major corporation, you would find a chief diversity officer, diversity training programs, employee resource groups, and detailed reports tracking demographic data. Companies proudly announced diversity goals, celebrated heritage months, and published elaborate statements about inclusion and belonging. But in early 2025, everything changed virtually overnight. President Trump's Executive Order 14151, titled Ending Illegal Discrimination and Restoring Merit-Based Opportunity, effectively dismantled federal DEI programs and sent shockwaves through corporate America. The order declared many diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives to be discriminatory and illegal, particularly when they involve race-conscious policies. Within weeks, we saw a corporate stampede. Major companies began quietly removing diversity language from their websites. Chief diversity officers were reassigned or let go. DEI departments were dissolved or rebranded. The very programs that companies had spent billions building over decades were being dismantled faster than they were created. But here's what's fascinating. Just 60 years before this dramatic reversal, most of these same companies actively discriminated based on race, gender, and religion, and it was perfectly legal. Help wanted ads explicitly stated whites only or men only. Companies had different pay scales for women doing identical work to men. Jewish applicants were routinely rejected from certain industries. So we've come full circle in a strange way. We've come from legal discrimination to forced compliance through civil rights laws to voluntary diversity programs worth billions of dollars, and now to what some are calling the dismantling of DEI entirely. The question is this: how did we get here? What was in that 60-year arc really about? And what does this sudden reversal tell us about whether diversity initiatives were ever really about creating equal opportunity, or whether they were always just performative responses to legal and social pressure. The answer reveals something uncomfortable about the origins of corporate diversity efforts and why they may have been so easy to dismantle. Because most companies don't embrace diversity out of moral awakening or business insight. They were forced into it by law and sued into compliance and pressured by social movements. And when that pressure changed direction, so did corporate behavior. Let's start in the early 1960s, before the Civil Rights Act. American workplaces were openly, legally segregated. It wasn't unusual for companies to have completely separate facilities for Black and white workers. Women were routinely fired when they got pregnant. Jewish professionals hit glass ceilings in industries dominated by Protestant elites. The justifications varied. Customers prefer it. It's just how things are done, separate but equal. But the result was systemic exclusion of anyone who wasn't a white Christian man for most professional opportunities. Then came the Civil Rights Act of 1964, particularly Title VII, which made it illegal to discriminate in employment based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. This wasn't a suggestion or a guideline, it was federal law with enforcement mechanisms. The Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, EEOC, was created to enforce Title VII. And suddenly companies had to prove they weren't discriminating. But here's the crucial detail. The law didn't just prohibit intentional discrimination. It also prohibited practices that had a disparate impact, policies that might seem neutral but disproportionately affected protected groups. Sounded promising, right? This is where the story gets really interesting because in the early 1970s, AT&T, then the largest private employer in America, faced a massive discrimination lawsuit. The EEOC and Department of Justice accused the company of systematic discrimination against women and minorities in hiring, promotion, and pay. The evidence was damning. AT&T had essentially segregated jobs by gender and race. Women were overwhelmingly telephone operators and clerical workers. Men dominated technical and management positions. Black workers were hired, when hired at all, were concentrated in the lowest paid positions. But here's what's crucial to understand. AT&T didn't just have explicit discriminatory policies. They had what appeared to be neutral systems that produced discriminatory outcomes. They recruited from certain schools. They relied on employee referrals. They promoted people who fit the culture, which meant people who looked and acted like existing leadership. They valued leadership presence, undefined criteria that somehow always favored white men. In 1973, AT&T settled with a consent decree that many consider the birth of modern corporate diversity programs. The company agreed to set specific hiring and promotion goals for women and minorities, track demographic data across the positions and levels, create training programs to prepare women and minorities for advancement, pay $15 million in back pay, worth about $100 million today, for those who had been discriminated against. This wasn't a voluntary initiative. AT&T fought the charges for years before settling. But the consent decree became a template for what other companies followed, often because they were facing similar legal pressure. This brings us to affirmative action, which is probably the most controversial aspect of this history. The term affirmative action actually came from President Kennedy's Executive Order 10925 in 1961, which required government contractors to take affirmative action to ensure equal opportunity regardless of race, creed, color, or national origin. But affirmative action evolved significantly under President Johnson, and particularly under President Nixon. Nixon's Labor Department, under Secretary George Shultz, developed the Philadelphia Plan in 1969, which required federal contractors to set aside specific goals and timetables for hiring minority workers. Here's what's crucial to understand. Affirmative action was never supposed to be about quotas or lowering standards. The original intent was to address the reality that even after discrimination became illegal, informal networks, biased assumptions, and structural barriers continued to exclude qualified candidates from underrepresented groups. When companies' hiring practices were investigated, they weren't explicitly rejecting qualified Black or female applicants. They were using selection criteria that had nothing to do with job performance, but favored white male candidates, requiring degrees from certain schools, valuing cultural fit, promoting people who reminded them of themselves, relying on networks that were predominantly white and male. The Bakke decision, the Regents of the University of California versus Bakke, ruled that while rigid racial quotas are unconstitutional, race can be considered as one factor among many in college admissions to promote diversity. Alan Bakke, a white applicant, denied admission to the UC Davis Medical School twice, despite having higher test scores than some minority students who were admitted through the quota system, successfully challenged the university's system. The Supreme Court agreed that 16 reserved spots were discriminatory, but affirmed that colleges could use race as a plus factor in a holistic review process. By the way, to give you context, I was in college and attended the University of California at Davis, where Bakke attended medical school. Anyway, subsequent cases refine this further, with the court generally supporting diversity as a compelling interest while prohibiting mechanical quotas. By the 1980s, corporate America had fully embraced, or at least accepted, diversity tracking and training. But something interesting happened. What started as legal compliance gradually conformed into diversity as business case. Companies began arguing that diversity wasn't just legally required, it was good for business. Studies showing that diverse teams were more innovative cropped up. Understanding diverse customers required diverse employees. Global businesses needed culturally competent workers. This reached its peak in the 2000s and the 2010s with the explosion of DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion, as its specialized corporate function. Companies hired chief diversity officers. They created elaborate metrics and dashboards tracking representation. They launched mentorship programs, sponsorship initiatives, employee resource groups. As an executive recruiter, I hired my share of chief diversity officers and held quarterly gatherings of several from major corporations to discuss common challenges and opportunities. But here's where it gets complicated. Despite all the investment and effort, progress was frustratingly slow. According to various reports, women still held only about 20 to 30% of C-suite positions. Blacks and Hispanic professionals remained significantly underrepresented in senior leadership. The statistics varied by industry and company, but the pattern was consistent. Lots of activity, limited results. The murder of George Floyd in 2020 triggered another wave of corporate diversity commitments. Companies released statements, pledged billions of dollars, set ambitious representation goals, but critics pointed out that many of these commitments echoed promises made decades earlier that were never fully realized. And then came January 2025. Executive Order 14151 declared that many DEI programs violate civil rights laws, the same laws that originally created the pressure for these programs. The order specifically targeted race-conscious hiring and promotion practices, diversity training that suggests certain groups are inherently privileged or oppressed, employee resource groups that exclude based on protected characteristics, grants, contracts, and programs that prioritize certain demographic groups. The irony is striking. Civil rights laws were used to create diversity programs, and now they're being used to dismantle them. The legal interpretation of what constitutes discrimination has fundamentally shifted. Within weeks, corporate America responded with remarkable speed, much faster than they had adopted DEI programs in the first place. Major corporations began removing diversity language from the websites and materials, dissolving or rebranding DEI departments, reassigning or laying off their chief diversity officers, canceling the diversity training programs, restructuring employee resource groups. The list goes on and on. This rapid reversal tells us something important about whether these initiatives were ever deeply embedded corporate culture or simply responses to external pressure. When the pressure changed direction, so did the corporate behavior, almost instantly. So I asked AI systems to analyze what this moment reveals about corporate diversity efforts and what actually drives equitable outcomes in organizations. What does the research show about merit, bias, and representation? The responses were eye-opening and point to something we've been avoiding, The real problem was never that we needed DEI programs. The problem was, and remains, what our supposedly merit-based systems were never actually merit-based to begin with. AI pointed to extensive research showing that even when organizations claim to evaluate purely on merit, they consistently favor relationships. People hire and promote those that they know, they like, and feel comfortable with. Pedigree. Candidates from prestigious schools or companies get preferential treatment regardless of actual performance. Loyalty. Long tenure is rewarded even when performance is mediocre. Cultural fit. Undefined, subjective criteria that consistently favor people similar to existing leadership. My favorite, executive presence. Again, subjective essentialism that correlate to demographic characteristics, not competence. One comprehensive analysis found that when companies claim to make objective hiring decisions without structured processes, they actually make more biased decisions, not fewer. Unstructured interviews, vague evaluation criteria, and reliance on gut feeling consistently produce homogeneous workforces, more of the same, not because of intentional discrimination, but because of how human decision-making actually works. AI went on to highlight research in what actually produces both merit-based outcomes and diverse representation, which includes structured interviews with standardized questions tied to actual job requirements. What these approaches have in common is that they make evaluation generally objective rather than relying on subjective judgment, relationships, or pedigree. And here's a fascinating finding. When organizations implement only merit-based system with these structured safeguards, representation of women and minorities improves naturally, not because the standards are lowered, but because barriers to recognize competence are removed. What strikes me about this AI analysis is the uncomfortable truth it reveals. We've been having the wrong argument for 60 years. The debate has been framed as diversity programs versus merit. But that's a false dichotomy. The real question is whether our evaluation systems actually measure merit or whether they measure proximity to power. Similarly to existing leadership and access to networks and pedigree. Most organizations have never had true merit-based systems. I know this to be true from having been an executive recruiter for over 20 years, including at one of the world's largest search firms. I know this for having supported recruiting efforts for over 10 years at 3 Fortune 100 companies and 1 Fortune 10 company. I'm not trying to disparage any of these organizations, but they've had relationship-based, pedigree-based, loyalty-based systems that they called merit-based because that sounds more legitimate than we promote people who remind us of ourselves, however unintentionally. DEI programs were created to address this problem, but they often became compliance theater, tracking demographics and running training programs rather than fundamentally reforming the biased systems that create unequal outcomes. So here's where we are. DEI programs are being dismantled, but the underlying problem, systems that claim to be merit-based but aren't, remains unchanged. This could simply return us to the pre-DEI status quo, where biased systems produce unequal outcomes and everyone pretends it's okay because of merit differences rather than system design. Or, and this is an opportunity hidden in the disruption, leaders could finally address the actual problem. If you truly believe in a meritocracy, prove it. Not by pointing to the absence of DEI programs, but by implementing genuinely objective evaluation systems. Here's what's interesting. If leaders actually implemented these practices, they wouldn't need DEI programs to achieve diverse representation. Competence would equal merit. And when that's consistently honored, you would naturally see greater representation across demographics because talent is actually distributed across all groups. The reason this hasn't happened isn't because it's difficult or expensive. It's because it requires leaders to give up the comfortable practices that favor people like them. Hiring from their alma maters, promoting people they golf with, trusting their gut rewarding loyalty over performance. It's easier to have a chief diversity officer and some training programs than to fundamentally change how power and opportunity are distributed. But now that the DEI infrastructure is gone, The question becomes, will leaders actually build merit-based systems, or will they simply return to the biased systems that created the problem in the first place? So here we are at a crossroads. The DEI programs that were supposed to create equal opportunity have been dismantled, but those programs were always addressing symptoms rather than causes, trying to diversify outcomes produced by fundamentally biased systems rather than fixing the systems themselves. The real test of organizational leadership isn't whether you have diversity programs. It's whether you have genuinely merit-based systems that consistently identify and reward competence regardless of who possesses it. If you're a leader who opposes DEI programs because you believe in pure meritocracy, this is your moment to prove it. Implement truly objective evaluation systems. Make your criteria transparent. Remove subjective judgment from high-stakes decisions, and then watch what happens to representation when competence is actually what determines success. My prediction? Organizations that do this will see more diverse representation than they ever achieved through DEI programs. Not because standards are lower, but because barriers to recognizing merit are removed. But organizations that simply go back to the old ways, hiring from networks, promoting based on fit, trusting gut feelings, and rewarding pedigree and loyalty, we'll see the same segregated outcomes as we did before DEI programs existed, and they'll have no excuse about why, because they've claimed those outcomes are the result of pure merit. Here's what I want to hear from you. If you're in leadership, are you willing to implement genuinely objectively based evaluation systems? Are you prepared to stop favoring people from your alma mater, your professional network, your golf club? Are you ready to define clear criteria and make decisions transparent? And for everyone else, have you experienced truly merit-based evaluation systems, or have you seen how relationships, pedigree, and subjective judgment actually drive decisions in organizations that claim to value only performance? What would it take to build systems that actually reward competence consistently? What would change if your organization, if hiring, promotion, and retention decisions were based on measurable performance rather than subjective assessments and personal connections? Drop a comment and tell me. Is this moment an opportunity to finally build genuinely merit-based systems, or will it simply return to the biased status quo with a new justification? If this conversation challenged your thinking about merit, bias, and organizational systems, hit the like button, share it with someone in leadership who needs to hear this, and subscribe for more honest explorations of how work actually functions. Until next time, remember, claiming to be merit-based is easy. Actually building systems that consistently identify and reward competence, regardless of who possesses it. That's the real work. And that work has never been more urgent than right now. You ready? Let's get to work. I know firsthand how taking that first step can be the catalyst for life-changing transformation. I remember the moment I decided to harness my own strengths, and it made all the difference in my career. That's why I've created a career mapping tool just for you, to help you uncover your unique competencies and leverage them to design your own career map. Take the first step toward your next level by clicking the link in the video description. And let's start this incredible journey together.